What's a tech company to do if it wants to power its AI ambitions? Well, Google is going nuclear. It is Google's first nuclear foray as the tech giant agreed to buy at least 6 small nuclear reactors from California's Kairos Power. Google needs new electricity sources as the growth of the generative AI has increased its electricity demand. The 500 megawatt that Google is buying is enough to power a mid-sized city. Meanwhile, AI takes a huge amount of power to function. For example, a ChatGPT question needs nearly 10 times as much electricity to process as a Google search. Tech companies are increasingly looking at nuclear energy in various forms as a quick and climate-friendly answer to its massive electricity needs. This week's announcement comes after Constellation Energy unveiled a $1.6 billion plan to restart a reactor at Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island plant in 2028.
This is a stark reversal from the era of the China Syndrome. Released 45 years ago, the hit film depicts a disaster at a nuclear plant in California, sparking fears that the reactor's core would melt down through the containment vessel all the way to China, hence the name. Less than 2 weeks after its release, life imitated art as a partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant in Pennsylvania quickly turned public opinion against nuclear energy and effectively halted the expansion of nuclear power in the United States. Now, tech companies are looking toward nuclear energy as its saving grace. Microsoft has a 20-year power purchase deal for 835 megawatts of nuclear facility in Pennsylvania. Amazon has also entered the search for clean energy after the tech giant bought a 960 megawatt data campus from Talon Energy, also in Pennsylvania. But is this safe, actually environmental, and realistic? Okay, so I just want to dispel some things because I know the nuclear industry has branded themselves as clean energy, but they're not. They dispose of so much toxic waste, and they're actually, in terms of energy sources, and there's a lot of clean energy out there now, like wind and solar, if we invested in them, if these tech companies would invest in them, for instance, that actually do reduce our energy consumption and help us hit those climate goals that we're supposed to hit, which we're not on track towards. You know, the toxic waste is going into water. There's radioactive aspects to this. We know about the history of nuclear, but I mean, what really concerns me is that when you have tech companies unregulated and they can just get away with what they want, this is creating an obstacle to hitting our climate goals. And honestly, you know, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, who goes around the world touting, you know, taking on the climate goals and really getting us on that path, it's really offensive that Microsoft is contributing to it. And I know that's just how companies work, and they like to greenwash, and they like to put money into foundations to solve the problems and get tax breaks and all of that, and nonprofit industrial complex. But it is incredibly concerning because not just with AI, which everyone seems to have now, and AI is supposed to be the solution for things like climate change, but it's contributing. And same thing with cryptocurrency too. I mean, the power needed to generate cryptocurrency is outrageous, and it hurts the environment.
Yeah, I guess the question is, would you do away with those technologies to save energy, or would you allow them to continue and recognize that nuclear power is apparently the only way that those can be powered in a cheap and efficient manner and in a fairly safe manner? I mean, nuclear energy is carbon-free, just like these wind and solar options that you've talked about, but the difference between nuclear and then wind and solar is that it's also abundant and reliable. Two things that those energy sources can't say that they have. And the Biden administration did invest billions of dollars through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very interestingly named bill, into so-called green energy. And we haven't really seen that it's given much benefit for a variety of reasons, one of which is that usually the government subsidizing industry doesn't give it a huge benefit in terms of its economic market share. But we also know that they've only built 7 electric vehicle chargers from that bill, and that wind and solar, based on pretty much every available environmental study, are not going to be enough to power the entire grid that Americans rely on in order to power their homes, to, if you're talking about EVs, to charge their vehicles, to make sure that people are not dying from cold and heat-related deaths, to make sure that we're able to have the infrastructure that right now is supported by fossil fuels that has reduced deaths by 98% due to natural disasters over the past 100 years. I mean, all of these things are considerations that have to be considered, not just the carbon output of energy when we're talking about an environmental discussion. So I don't fault these companies at all for looking into nuclear. You brought up nuclear waste. It's true that there is waste that comes from pretty much any energy source, including wind, solar, and batteries from electric vehicles. Those all have significant waste as well. In fact, nuclear waste is typically smaller because the power is contained in a smaller area. So, I mean, I just guess my question for you is, what do you view as the alternative? Is it no AI so that we can not have these companies use nuclear, or is it we switch fully over to wind, solar, and hydrogen energy, and basically accept the fact that it's going to be more expensive for Americans, less abundant, and less reliable?
Well, we have a free market in our country, as we know too well, and oftentimes unregulated. First off, there's over 192,000 publicly available charging ports that are attached to the Inflation Reduction Act. But aside from that, and there's also the tax credit program in terms of wind and solar that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, including those charging stations. So I think right now the way that we're looking at it is flawed. I mean, if it is more expensive to have wind and solar, which it's not, by the way, it is cheaper to have solar. In New York, they're now offering it in exchange for Con Ed, which is, my Con Ed bill is through the roof. It's almost like the level of my rent. That's my power bill every month. And if I lived in an apartment that chose to go solar, it would be nothing. I mean, that's wild. And they get tax credits, which of course most buildings want to have. So there are a lot of incentives out there for companies to invest in wind and solar does not have any toxic attributes to it. Neither does wind. People don't like the noise. They don't like how it looks, but it's still a clean energy. And aside from this, what we have to also keep in mind is this is a bipartisan issue. It is a bipartisan topic that Republicans and Democrats do want to go towards, and they are investing in wind and solar. Nuclear, it's not even about jobs anymore. Maybe in this election they're talking about jobs. I think the tech companies, which are unregulated, I would like to have AI regulated. I would like for crypto to go away because it's a national security threat. I think the tech companies have a responsibility to practice what they preach and invest in wind and solar, because the more you have of it, the cheaper it gets. It's already pretty cheap. And on top of that, let's just talk about national security for a second, because nuclear is one of our weak points for national security. This has been discussed ad hominem. We are so over this conversation. I mean, this conversation is going on since the early 80s, late 70s, that not only could terrorists intervene in our nuclear systems, but foreign governments. And I just feel it's a very bizarre thing for tech companies to want to involve themselves in at this moment, especially with AI, with all the conversations about lack of regulation and terrorism that could potentially be pushed through AI. It's just peculiar, and I hope that the U.S. government actually looks into this a little bit more.
Let's start with your claims that there are no pollutants or waste that come from some of these so-called clean energies from solar. That's actually not true. So according to veterans of the U.S. solar industry and former government officials, pollutants such as lead or carcinogenic cadmium can be completely washed out of the fragments of solar modules over a period of just several months from rainwater. And they also the solar panels don't last forever. So when the panels eventually need to be replaced, you have to dispose of them in some way. And they do have toxic waste materials within them. So everything that you use, that you consume, is going to have some kind of waste associated with it. Now, on the question as well of savings, sure, over time, maybe over a period of 10 to 15 years, people will eventually save. They'll break even on what they would have been paying for an electric bill previously, for a gas bill, et cetera. But a lot of people, particularly low and middle income people, don't have the ability to dump $10,000 to $20,000, sometimes more, into outfitting their home with solar panels, because that's a one-time upfront cost. A lot of commercial businesses or landlords of apartment complexes can certainly afford to do that, but a lot of homeowners can't. That's a really significant expense for them. And then I didn't hear you address the problem of reliability. There was a study about replacing the coal mines in West Virginia, for example, with solar energy, and they found that it simply wasn't feasible because the climate in West Virginia does not support the idea that year-round, every single day, they're going to be able to get enough energy from the sun in order to provide the same amount of power that those coal plants were. So, I mean, that's a fundamental trade-off that we're going to have to address if we're making this huge environmental changeover.
Well, that's why I think our government needs to keep providing these incentives, and companies need to keep investing in wind and solar and other green energy. I mean, there's green energy out there, and they're cost effective. They provide jobs. There's a lot of options on the table here, but we will, I'm sure, continue to discuss this moving forward. We have a lot more topics to come. Stay tuned.